Welcome to the Keen on Yoga podcast. Hope you're all having a great week. I'm slightly reticent for this podcast today, slightly nervous because it's on a difficult subject. So I think I'll probably just get straight into it, and then I can do with the extra bit of what I'm doing, etc. later, Because today's podcast is just me. It's a solo one, and it's on systemic abuse in the yoga world. And, I don't want to dwell on the negative. I feel like I could always come across as pointing out the negative, but it's still there, right? Ever since the Me Too movement with Patabi Joyce, I kind of feel that we should have learnt more than maybe we did, yeah? And it's still evident. And I don't want to harp on about anything. There's all water under the bridge, everything like that. Other than saying that, I would never put Patabi Joyce's photos in the front of the room anymore, unfortunately. I don't want to touch upon this issue any further. Nevertheless, we still have this, what I feel is an elephant in the room somewhat, because, and I don't feel it's particularly, it's not such that it's particular to Ashtanga yoga or particular to even yoga. It's when any established order comes in that involves certain rules or certain hierarchy, even if it's just a temporary one, right? Yeah, which it is, obviously. This comes into play. This factor of controlling each other and, unfortunately, abusing each other. Yeah? And it's we don't need to go. As I said, I'm not going to talk on the Patabi Joyce issue, and we've done enough of that. And nowadays, I have to say, I think it's generally more psychological abuse than physical abuse, right? Although I would say, especially sexual abuse, but I would say that we still have that with the adjustments. I call that a sense of this hard adjustment on another person's body to bend it into a shape that it doesn't do. I would call that physical abuse. I would, I'm afraid. And I know that not everyone's with me on that. Yeah, and I suppose this is one thing: is that we, more than ever, really afraid to voice our own opinions if they're not consensual, right? If we're not part of something, then we're out of something. Yeah, there's increasingly little middle ground, right, where we can tolerate different kinds of narratives in one public space, right? And I feel like now we can't say one word or put one foot out of line. We're out, right? Which makes it increasingly worrying. This kind of, especially worrying when you see a whole list of Mysore protocol before you even get in the door, right? You've read it on the website before you've gone to Mysore so-and-so place. Or this whole list of basically, you call it systemic or established control, really, right? And as I said, it's not particular to Ashtanga, so I don't want to say, it's just Ashtanga. Ashtanga's so bad, or that we're all wrong. The Ashtanga community, not at all. But I kind of feel that we need to keep pointing out issues where we can do better. Yeah, issues where we're letting ourselves down, like any group. And the problem with established control, right? The problem with certain people in established control is that it kind of works for them, and unfortunately, control and having everyone under one's control usually works for the people in the power of that control, sadly enough. Yeah. And different voices, like my own, in fact, aren't tolerated, right? As I've said before, I've had my fair share of kickback, and I don't really think I'm saying anything really terrible, right? I'm not ultimately criticizing Ashtanga or the method. I'm just pointing out some possible blind spots that we have. But that's not allowed, right? And, as I said, there is, and we all know, there is little tolerance in the public sphere for any varied thoughts or opinions. Okay, so when I said systemic abuse, what does that really mean? Because a part of it is just getting clear with language, or at least clear with what we mean about language, because language, of course, can mean different things to different people. And that's part of the problem. When we say something, we might think it's nothing, yeah? But for someone else, that's something, right? For example, for years, I talked about modifications, just as a silly little example, really. If you can't do this, the modification is this. But of course, that blind spot in me didn't realize, because I was very able in my youth, and I didn't need modifications. It didn't make me think how I'd feel if someone said, well, if you can't do this, then this is the modification, and how weighted that language is, right? Say, well, I don't want to do, if you're in a lead class, I don't want to do the modification. I can do this, and then you injure yourself because it's a modification, not a different option, right? And again, all this can easily go into wokeness, right? And wokeness obviously being the extreme of, I don't know how to describe it even, right? A kind of oversensitivity in a certain sense, right? I'm for the middle ground, I think, just for a balanced perspective. But there's definitely things that we need to address in language and things and ways that we need to readdress our relationships to each other in the current politic. Because also the thing is, times change, climate changes, where physical touch might have been appropriate at one point. It's less and less so now, for example, in the way that we relate to each other in the outside world. So the climate of things changes as well. Yeah. And things don't stay the same. And where one thing might mean one thing at a certain time, give it a number of years later, and it doesn't. Yeah? So the context is also very specific and appropriate. But anyway, I can go down sidetracks very easily, as you probably know. So systemic abuse. If you look it up, generally something like the abuse of people. How would I call this? Sorry. I'm trying to get myself clear. Something like when neutral rules are developed by authorities that end up being aggressively applied. Yep, that's one. That's one definition of it, right? When certain rules end up being aggressively applied for the so-called benefit of the people, right? Or simply the most obvious way of saying it is systemic abuse, when the establishment in power uses their power to control other people, right? And dismiss it at the same time whilst claiming that they're simply doing it for the benefit of the people. So this is all very difficult territory because, of course, to a certain extent in the yoga room, it's not just, I'm not for the pin, we're all just mates, we're all just friends, your students are just your friends. You might be surprised to hear that way I talk often. You might be surprised. But that's not my opinion, because I think we need to play a certain hierarchy all the time in life. And it's just a play, but someone has to be in charge kind of thing, especially to hold that space safe. I'm responsible as a teacher, I'm not just another person on the floor, I'm responsible more than the other people because I've invited them to my class. Yeah, so I have that responsibility to be in charge, to hold that safe space, to make sure that people don't end up infringing each other's rights, etc. Yeah, and know where the fire exits are, for example. I have more responsibility because I have some degree of hierarchy there. But it's a play, just like when you go into, I don't say go into a bank anymore, I was thinking of that, old-fashioned, right? The bank being a place of authority, but somewhere where the doctors run, right? Or seeing a surgeon or someone, someone in a position of authority, then you have a sense of respect. They're in this position of specialization of power, and you have a sense of deferration towards them. But it's not like you inherently say, "Well, I'm literally not as good as you." It's just simply, well, in this specialized field, we have some sense of structure here because it's useful. Yeah. But the problem is that we have to trust those people to hold that structure and not use it to abuse us, basically to put it more simply. And this occurs, literally, right, by psychological abuse, which is more obvious. I've heard it in many places, to men to women, from women to women, and from men to men, I remember hearing a number of years ago, I shan't say where, someone, a man, in fact, not being able to do Quran, and the male teacher said, "Look, even the women can do it better than you," right? For example, and then it, of course, this perpetuates to it. So it's not necessarily gender specific. Yeah. I mean, not bringing another contentious issue into the fray here. I've got enough on my hands. But it probably varies depending on whether men, it's men to women or women to women or men to men, right? Probably has a sense of a variation, but nevertheless, so it'd be physical abuse, as I pointed out. I think often the adjustment is literally physical abuse, sadly. Sexual abuse, that we've talked about that. I said I didn't really want to go into it today, but there is still, I hate to say it, a somewhat predatory feeling around some men in in these spaces towards women, sadly enough, right? So yeah, that's there. And psychological abuse is rampant, right? And also the more difficult one, even to put on it, is a kind of gaslighting, right? It's like not exactly overt psychological abuse, but the control of people's approach to themselves and attitude towards their space. And it's more insidious than just simply kind of like, shaming someone. We see that, as I mentioned, the above, what I just said, to man on man, was, that they couldn't do a posture, simply shaming. Or we used to hear more, you're too big to do this posture, or whatever, you're not strong enough, or, your body, blah, 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 is like this. It's all overt shaming, right? And it shouldn't go on. It shouldn't go on. And at the end of this, unfortunately, I don't want to say cynical podcast, I'll talk about a couple of ways that we might be able to start to guard against this more. Yeah? But then, and then, of course, the abuse is holding these neutral rules, these apparent neutral rules of the space, as I said, the dictionary definition of systemic abuse, right? The rules of the space, apparently neutral to protect other people, are used essentially to commit aggression or violence towards those same people. Well, that's obvious, unfortunately, in the Ashtanga room, isn't it? The rules are there for your good, but I'm going to stop you here, right? Even though I'm not stopping that person, or because they're more of a favourite, or, all these little ways of controlling people in the Mysore, right? Why are you doing that? Yeah, that's not Ashtanga, And then, as I said, there's not toleration for differences of approach in the Mysore room, right? It's not, if you're not in, you're out. So the teacher is generally incredibly common that there's a sense of clique in the Mysore room with the advanced students that know what they're doing, that are following the rules, that are favourites, that are doing what the teacher wants. And then there's those students, that are not doing what the teacher wants, that are not able to follow the rules. Maybe their body doesn't even make the shapes in the way that the teacher would like them to, right? But they're not favourites. They're not popular. They're not in the in crowd of the Mysore room, right? And they're discriminated against. Yeah. Unfortunately, there's a huge amount of discrimination in the Mysore room still, and it's often ableism, just simple ableism. Certain people are able to make the postures, yep, and certain people can't do the things, even for love or money. Their bodies won't do them, and then they're discriminated against. Sorry, pause for a coffee break as I think more. So, I'm just trying to point things out. I'm not saying that happening in your Mysore room, of course, and I'm not saying it's, I'm not saying it's unfixable. I'm just saying that it is a problem still. There is a problem, and we haven't learned as much as we might have learned from the abuses of Patabi Joyce, because there still isn't a structure for. There's still no transparency. There's no accountability. There's no democratic avenues for discussion. Yeah, if you don't say the things that people want, they'll close you down. They'll shut you out. Literally, how many people have we heard have been kicked out of my groups? I've heard a number. How could that happen? Yep. Even if their people aren't doing exactly what you want them to do, in my opinion, I've had a number of these people, right? They don't do anything like what I would like them to do in the Mysore room, right? But I'd rather them in that space. Yeah, maybe they'll come around. Yeah, it's one place that surely we should be able to be ourselves, even if that means that maybe we end up playing out some of our things. Because remember, we're the teacher. Yeah, we're not the student. Yeah? We're holding that space. Yeah, they can do things that we can't do on our side. Do you see what I mean? So they could act up. Yeah, but we should be essentially say we're all adults, but essentially the adult in that space, allowing these things to come out in that space, and allowing that maybe we all have things that come out in those spaces and we don't act perfectly. Then if we don't act perfectly, because that's what yoga is about, becoming more natural, becoming more identified back with ourselves again, and that in that process things come out. Yeah. So we shouldn't expect that we have to behave perfectly all the time. in order to be accepted again, once again. If you do all the things that I want you to do, you'll be accepted. And if you don't, then there'll be attempts at controlling you first, then shaming you maybe, then ostracizing you, and discriminating against you if you still come, or maybe just kicking you out altogether. Unbelievable. But as I say, I'm not making this stuff up, It's still happening, right? It's still happening in the yoga world. So what good can talking do about it? Well, as I said, I'm going to mention a couple of extra things at the end. But I mean, first and foremost, that we're all aware of this as teachers. We're aware of our what's called a counter-transference, really, right? So a student might transfer emotions towards us, right? Kicking against authority, for example, right? The projection is we're the strict parent, and they're playing out a certain dynamic. I mean, I know it sounds maybe far-fetched, but I've certainly had that feeling towards male Ashtanga teachers. Yeah, so easy to go back into that childhood mode, where they're the father and they're giving these rules and controlling my space again, and you become that child again, At least I think that's the case for many of us. But as a teacher, you can also have these emotions triggered in you, counter-transference, when they make you act like a child, or like a father, or mother, or whatever, So that's counter-transference. But as a teacher, I said, our responsibility is higher than the student, because basically we invited them there in the first place. It's our party, as it were. We have to take care of the house. We're not all having the same party. Like when you have your own party, or you throw a dinner party, and everyone's having a good time, It's like, not to say that we're not having a good time at all in the Ashtanga as teachers, but, we're not all having the same experience. We shouldn't be, They're there to practice. We're there to hold that space. Yeah, it's not a tit for tat, as we say. Anyway, I mean, all this was triggered for me, by a recent correspondence I had, and it was with a student, and it was detailing this situation of, and it was a psychological abuse situation, and the response from the established teacher, let's say well-known teacher, exactly mirrored this systemic abuse, and the kind of establishments still wishing to brush it under the carpet. Yeah. So what I would say is that, as teachers, we have the individual responsibility to try and step up to this platform, but especially if we're influential teachers, or more kind of established in that hierarchy of Ashtanga, which for good or for bad seems to still be evident, that we have an extra responsibility now, right? And it was textbook stuff. It was really textbook stuff what came back in terms of the response from this students pointing out the abuse in the class, right? And first of all, this is simply a sense of defensiveness, right? Like, well, everyone else is fine, and then secondly, it's like, well, my experience was this. So first of all, it's like, well, everyone else, right? So it's an appeal to the status quo, right? And then secondly, it's like, well, my experience has always been that this has been perfectly normal, right? So it's not, looking at the other person's experience and saying what your experience is, right? This is gaslighting in the modern parlance, perfect example of. And then finally, it's saying, well, it's a denial, an utter denial of the person's feelings. So I say, well, your subjective experience must be misconstrued, right? There must be a lack of perception on your part, perhaps just a mismatch of energies, right? So again, if we want to look at gaslighting, basically it's a psychological manipulation, but based upon the fact of denying the person's having those experiences that they are, right? Continue lying in the face of pointing out the otherwise, right? It's not, I'm not demonizing anyone here. I'm certainly it's a tough position to be in, facing any kind of how should we call it, critique of one's behaviour, right? Because we're all human after all. I mean, I certainly am, and we say things at times. We all do. We wish we probably hadn't said, or we could have said in a different way, But nevertheless, there has to be culpability. There has to be the ability to hold one's hand up and face personal critique of actions, personal feedback, right? And because we're in this sense, I think it's a sense of the establishment around anything really, and especially Ashtanga's got this quite strong established kind of hierarchy that it's almost like there's an immunity from established power to further feedback, right? The power discrepancy being so great, and it's still there. There's a lack of democracy, and it's tricky because, as I said, we need a certain sense of democracy, right? But on the other hand, we need some sense of hierarchy as well. Yeah? So I cannot put my finger on an obvious and immediate solution, but I kind of feel like we're circling around, pointing out that there's something still evident. And so oftentimes when I've heard a teacher having been challenged about something that was said or done, simple denial of the person's experience, right? And then to go through it again, because it's a classic denial of the person's experience. Well, it must just be that your energy and mine are not matched, not aligned. It's nothing to do with your personal experience. That's not valid. Just a miscommunication. And secondly, well, of course, everyone else found it okay. Well, did they? Or maybe they're not speaking up, right? It appeal to the general consensus because the status quo in any establishment is very powerful, right? So, but the thing is, no one wants to speak up, do they? Just like in the case of Batabi Joyce, right? People knew many years earlier. In fact, I would suggest that anyone who was there knew what was going on up until the late years of Batabi Joyce, when he became too ill and old. People were it was common knowledge. And yet the establishment was so great. If you said something, you were out of the group, right? So appeal to the established order, because no one wants to stick their head up and be the only one saying it, right? And you can guarantee, just like me, if other people whisper it to you and then you're the one to say it, they'll duck down again and you're left there standing alone, right? It takes a lot of courage to speak up. Yep. So appeal to the status quo. Well, everyone else found it fine. Yeah. Well, no one else sees this. Yeah. Of course, it's a classic example of getting around something, right? And then finally, it's like, well, I found it okay. My experience was thus. I was doing this. Well, it's like, well, yeah, you may have been doing this. You may have been thinking that, but the person received this as their understanding of your actions, right? In my mind, I was just doing no. You see, fair enough. I mean, and as teachers, you also have the recourse to say your perspective, right? But on the other hand, we have to tolerate another person's experience of that adjustment, of those words, of that whole experience, yeah. And it can be hard, and I've had some myself, I have to say, now and again, and because my whole manifesto is to try and hold rather soft and open and safe spaces for people. I'm not one of those strict teachers. I don't have it so much, but there's been times when I've said something that wasn't appropriate, yeah. Because, we all go through stuff as well, and I've done this for 25 years. So, you have your moments, but at the time you do, it's imperative that you can step up and say, look, let's have a talk about this, sit down, and, and the best thing is often just to say, look, I will say, I'm sorry. I was made a mistake, I was wrong, yeah? And often that's enough, right? To say that you had an error of judgment, right? But I think we're often really frightened even to say that. And again, going back to, suppose circling back to the last questions of what we can do, right? And what can be done now, rather than just harping on about some negativity, right? As it seems to have been the nature of this podcast. What can we do now? Well, as I said, first of all, there has to be avenues, right? It has to be avenues, direct avenues from teacher to student. And these is best done out of class, really, not in the class. Because that's, obviously the class ought to be a safe space, but if it's not found as a safe space, then we can't necessarily talk about it in the class. So it needs to be another time to approach. Maybe an email or maybe a short meetup. That's why often in the lead class, I say, when I used to teach lead classes for an established yoga centre in London, I used to say, well, look, after the class, I'm going to be around for 5-10 minutes. If you want to speak up, and not to say I was abusing anyone in the class, but if you want to come and say anything or have a chat with me, I'm there. Some space which is not, class led, kind of class space when you're doing something specific. Yeah. And then, maybe some form of anonymous feedback. This is easier in a yoga center where people can give anonymous feedback, sometimes at the desk, in a box or verbally to someone. Often doesn't happen. There's no, one aspect of particularly of Ashtanga that I often come back to is there's no board of governance here whatsoever. There's no accountability. There's no structure around teachers. They're just, after your TT, you're kind of cast out to do what you want with no supervision, no how would you call it, mentorship. That's imperative to the career. Yep, I would say hairdressers have a lot more mentorship than yoga teachers, and not to say you belittle that profession whatsoever, but they're not touching people and in such an intimate connection usually as the yoga teachers are. It's one of the most intimate connections with people, one of the most possible places of potential abuse, and yet there's absolutely no mentorship or framework of accountability to make any of this secure, really. I mean, it's absolutely insane if you think about it. Yeah. So that's what I'd like to see. And then, of course, more of the established teachers speaking up and saying this stuff, right? But as I said, I mean, it's a kind of quality, an ultimate quality of the establishment to protect the established order, which is why no one spoke up about Pattabhi Jois for so long, because he was the head and it worked while he was the head, and no one else wanted to say anything and potentially be kicked out of that. And they all had power that was invested in Pattabhi Jois being the head and their relationship with Pattabhi Jois, because they were in senior positions that he basically endorsed, right? He was the ultimate kingmaker, right? So if you took him down, you took your own position down too within that structure. So the establishment has its vested interest, it has its structure. So yes, it's a difficult position. But does that mean we need to just throw the towel in and say, well, it's just human nature to control each other? Yeah, because it is. Of course it is, And as to go back to the start again, finally, it's not to say, this is just a terrible thing that happens in Ashtanga. Not at all. It happens all over. But what can we do better in Ashtanga to avoid this kind of brushing under the carpet of its systemic abuse and gaslighting that is still happening, all the time? Every week I get an email from someone. This teacher said this about me, that my body would never do that. I wasn't good enough. I ought to be able to do that. All this stuff. Even I saw something on Facebook the other day about someone's social politics were brought into they were accused of being a lefty or something. And I was like, it's just crazy what's happening. And again, this isn't pointed out because of the structure of power within that room. Yeah. Anyway, kind of harping on the same point now, so I better bring it to a close. And I hope that I've piqued some interest, and I'm sure that there's more things to say about this, and I haven't fully covered everything I'd like to say on this subject. But I just kind of use the podcast on my solo episodes oftentimes to draw attention to the things that are still there to think about, and not by way of offering conclusion, really, but by way of provoking, my get out clause, but provoking further inquiry, and, for all of us to think, well, how is it that we may still, because I'm sure also you may be on both ends, right? You may have been somewhat abused as a student, right? Generally it's not too, hopefully it's not too bad usually, because I was not physically abused, although I was in the brunt of a few adjustments, but I was definitely verbally abused by certain teachers. And then when I started, I suppose in my very early days, literally the first couple of years, perhaps I took that as a benchmark of Ashtanga, to be rather domineering and assertive and critical even of students as part of the method, that we learn by being, kind of punished and told off rather than being endorsed and encouraged and motivated. That we can't learn through kindness, that we have to learn through stricture and aggression, As I said, these neutral, the definition of perhaps like most of systemic abuses, neutral rules that are meant to be neutral applied aggressively towards individuals, right? It's like the person's been with you for 10 years, and they still can't stand up out of a back bend because maybe they started in their older years, or their body won't do that, right? And yet, no, you can't progress into intermediate series because you can't stand up out of a back bed, or someone will never do married D. But no, you have to stop there. The rule is that it's for your own good, for for your own good, right? But I'm going to aggressively apply that rule to you for why? What would make that a reasonable idea? I mean, of course, there are rules, and they're sometimes logistical for crowd control, right? If someone's been with you a couple of months and they're just doing all kinds of stuff, then you want to pull them in a bit and just make them help themselves be more methodical, more centered, more pragmatic in their approach. But the rules, it's just a question of how we use the rules, to go back to that old chestnut again. Anyway, that's me for today. And I'm sorry to be a bit of a down on this podcast, but I'm sure you get enough upbeat, positive ones out of me as well. So next time, I promise I'll give you a much more optimistic one. I promise. And if you want to hear anything else from me after this, any other topics, any other thoughts in your mind that I might be able to speak to, then let me know. Let me know, and I'd love to have a go. Right? Or then, these kind of ones come out of people's comments anyway, right? Like this last one did. What's coming up? Well, I've got my online intensive starting. If you couldn't catch the first one of the online intensive, you can always sign up later and you get all the videos and everything sent to you already. Otherwise, maybe I'll see you in Goa. That's coming up on the horizon, Purple Valley in Goa for 2 weeks, or in Malaga. Don't forget, we've got the Christmas retreat in Malaga, which is going to be fantastic. It's with Ellen Johansson, the Buddhist meditator and Ashtanga yoga teacher of many years, and myself. She'll be doing the meditation this time. I'll be doing the Ashtanga, and it's literally over Christmas Day. I think it's a week over Christmas Day. It doesn't quite catch the New Year, but it's over Christmas. So if you fancy getting off and doing something different for Christmas this year, then I'd love to see you in Malaga. You'll get some sun there as well, because it'll be nice. It'll be bright. It won't be warm, but it'll be bright, and you can sit outside in the sun and all that, so you have a great time if you can join. Anyway, I'll see you next week again. Well, I won't see you, but I'll hear you next week. We'll be together whilst I interview another guest together. So until then, have a great week, and thanks for listening. Bye for now.